April 1945. A former military training ground in western Germany, now ringed with barbed wire and wooden guard towers. The war in Europe is days from its end, though inside the camp time moves differently, measured in roll calls, ration lines, and the distant rumble of artillery that grows quieter each morning. A group of German women steps through a narrow gate into a fenced courtyard. Some wear the remnants of auxiliary uniforms. Others have civilian coats pulled tight against the cold spring air. They expect another inspection, another list of instructions delivered in clipped English. Instead, an American sergeant points toward a strip of freshly turned earth along the inner fence. Tools lie stacked beside it: shovels, small rakes, seed packets in plain paper envelopes. For a moment, no one moves. The ground is soft from recent rain. The soil smells of thaw and new growth. The war has taken cities, families, and certainty. Yet here, inside a guarded compound, they're being told to plant flowers. The quiet confusion settles into something deeper, an unfamiliar routine beginning to take shape, even as the war around them is still ending. By the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing from every direction. Allied forces had crossed the Rhine. Soviet armies were advancing from the east with overwhelming force. German infrastructure, railways, factories, and command networks had been shattered by years of bombing and retreat. In cities and towns across Germany, civilians and military personnel alike were moving through the final weeks of the war in a state of exhaustion and uncertainty. Among those caught in this collapse were tens of thousands of German women attached to the war effort. Some had served as auxiliaries in communications units, air defense batteries, and clerical offices. Others were nurses in military hospitals or members of civil defense organizations. Many were civilians displaced by the rapid advance of Allied troops. As front lines dissolved, surrender often came not through formal negotiations, but through simple encounters. Columns of soldiers and civilians stepping forward with raised hands, white cloths, or improvised signals of compliance. American forces, advancing through Western Germany in early 1945, began processing large numbers of prisoners. While the majority were male soldiers, U.S. units also encountered female personnel connected to the German military system. The status of these women varied. Some were uniformed auxiliaries legally considered part of the armed forces. Others were civilian workers attached to military infrastructure. Still others were refugees who had fled combat zones and found themselves inside areas now under Allied control. The handling of prisoners fell under established military procedures shaped by the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. The United States, a signatory, maintained administrative structures designed to house, register, and manage captured personnel. Camps were set up in recently secured areas across France, Belgium, and Germany, as well as in the United States itself. Temporary enclosures, sometimes converted training grounds, airfields, or barracks complexes, were expanded into organized camps with guard perimeters, medical stations, and supply depots. For female prisoners and internees, arrangements were often improvised. Many camps had been designed primarily for male combatants. Separate compounds or fence sections were created to house women, usually under supervision that included both male guards and female military staff, such as nurses or administrative personnel. The goal, from the American perspective, was to maintain order while adhering to international standards of treatment. That meant providing food, shelter, and medical care, while also establishing routines that would reduce unrest and maintain discipline. Inside these compounds, daily life quickly settled into structure. Morning roll calls counted and recorded each prisoner. Meals were distributed according to available supply lines, which in late war conditions were strained but increasingly stable for Allied forces. Work assignments were introduced where possible. Prisoners might clean barracks, assist in kitchens, or perform maintenance tasks within the camp perimeter. These assignments were not merely practical. They were intended to impose routine, something military administrators believed essential for maintaining psychological stability among large groups of displaced people. For many German prisoners, particularly women who had been raised under years of wartime propaganda. Expectations about capture were shaped by fear. Official messaging inside Germany had long warned that surrender to Allied forces could bring harsh treatment or retaliation. Stories circulated, some exaggerated, some rooted in isolated incidents, of violence and humiliation at the hands of enemy troops. As a result, the first days inside an American-run camp often carried a tension that went beyond physical captivity. Prisoners watched closely. They measured behavior. They tried to understand what rules would govern their new reality. American camp commandants, for their part, faced a complex task. They were responsible not only for security, but for the management of human beings who had lived for years under a rigid ideological system, now collapsing around them. The war had not yet officially ended. Armed conflict continued in scattered pockets. Yet inside these compounds, administrators were already confronting the longer-term question of how to maintain order among prisoners who might remain in custody for months or even years. As spring advanced and the front lines moved eastward, camps in the western zones grew more stable. Supply chains improved. Temporary facilities became more organized. The immediate chaos of surrender gave way to a quieter, more controlled environment. Within that environment, small changes in routine, changes that might have seemed insignificant outside the wire, began to carry unexpected meaning for those inside. As April turned into May 1945, the military situation in Europe shifted from active combat toward occupation and administration. German forces in the West surrendered in large numbers. Cities that had once served as regional command centers were now filled with displaced civilians, liberated forced laborers, and captured personnel waiting for processing. American units moved from rapid advance to stabilization. Their responsibilities expanded beyond fighting. They now governed territory, secured infrastructure, and managed the growing population of prisoners under their control. Within U.S.-administered camps in Western Germany, the early days of uncertainty began to give way to routine. Guard schedules stabilized. Kitchens operated on predictable timetables. Medical units treated not only injuries from combat, but also illnesses linked to malnutrition, exposure, and long periods of displacement. The camps were still temporary in design, rows of barracks or repurposed buildings enclosed by fencing, but they increasingly functioned as organized communities under military oversight. 4 German women held in these compounds. The transition from war zone to controlled environment was abrupt. Only weeks earlier, many had been part of a system that demanded strict discipline and ideological loyalty. Some had worn uniforms. Others had worked in hospitals or communications offices tied directly to military operations. Now, they found themselves on the opposite side of the structure they had once served. Their days were governed by foreign guards speaking a different language, following procedures shaped by a different set of rules. American camp administrators recognized that prolonged inactivity among prisoners often led to tension. Historical experience from earlier conflicts had shown that boredom and uncertainty could produce unrest, depression, and disciplinary problems. As a result, the U.S. Army's camp management doctrine emphasized routine and supervised activity. Work details were assigned not only to maintain the camp itself, but also to create structure within the daily schedule. Cleaning, cooking, repairing clothing, and maintaining living areas became standard tasks. These assignments were regulated and limited to what international law permitted, particularly for non-combatant or auxiliary prisoners. Recreation and controlled leisure activities were also introduced when possible. Chaplains organized religious services for prisoners who wished to attend. Reading materials, often censored or carefully selected, were distributed through camp libraries. Educational programs appeared in some facilities, especially after Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945, when the immediate urgency of combat gave way to occupation policies and long-term planning. One of the more understated aspects of this evolving routine was the use of outdoor space. Camps that occupied former training grounds or open fields had small areas that could be adapted for practical or morale-related purposes. In some locations, prisoners were permitted to cultivate small garden plots within the perimeter. The decision was partly logistical. Growing vegetables could supplement rations and provide fresh produce during the warmer months. But it also served another function. Gardening created a visible cycle of growth and maintenance, something that contrasted sharply with the destruction that had defined the previous years of war. For German women in captivity, the introduction of such activities could be disorienting. The structure of the camps was still unmistakably military. Guard towers, barbed wire, armed patrols. Movement remained restricted. Letters home, when permitted, passed through sensors and traveled slowly through disrupted postal systems. News from outside arrived in fragments. Yet within this controlled environment, certain routines began to resemble elements of ordinary life. Washing clothes in designated areas, mending uniforms and civilian garments, attending supervised gatherings, and in some cases, tending small patches of soil. American personnel involved in camp administration often viewed these measures pragmatically. Order and predictability reduced the likelihood of unrest. Activities that occupied prisoners' time made the task of supervision easier. At the same time, adherence to international standards of treatment reinforced the United States' broader political goals. The war in Europe was ending, but the post-war world was already taking shape. How prisoners were treated would influence future relations, public perception, and the moral authority claimed by the occupying powers. Inside the camps, however, these broader strategic considerations were not always visible. What prisoners experienced directly were the details of daily life. The tone of a guard's voice during roll call, the quality of bread in the morning ration, the presence or absence of small privileges. When camp authorities designated a section of ground for planting, flowers, herbs, or vegetables, the gesture carried multiple meanings. It suggested time would continue. It implied that the camp, though temporary, might exist long enough for seeds to grow and bloom. It introduced an element of care into a setting defined by confinement. For women who had spent months or years in the rigid atmosphere of wartime Germany, the contrast was striking. The system that had once governed every aspect of life was gone. In its place stood a new structure, foreign, controlled, and uncertain, yet unexpectedly structured around routine rather than retaliation. The soil inside the fence became one of the quiet markers of that shift, hinting at a deeper transformation taking place beneath the surface of captivity. Human angle, routine inside the wire. In the weeks after Germany's surrender, the tempo inside American-run camps slowed into a steady rhythm. For the women held there, the sudden transition from wartime urgency to controlled routine created a strange sense of suspension. The outside world was rebuilding, though news arrived slowly and in fragments. Inside the wire, days became structured around predictable tasks. Wake at first light, roll call in rows along the fence, breakfast from metal containers carried across the yard, assigned work details, inspection, evening count. The absence of bombardment was itself disorienting. For years, air raid sirens and distant explosions had shaped daily life across Germany. Now the loudest sounds were boots on gravel, a guard's whistle, or the clatter of kitchen equipment. Some prisoners described the silence as heavier than noise. Without constant threat, attention shifted inward to memory, uncertainty, and a long question of what would come after release. Within this environment, small changes took on emotional weight. Access to personal items, the ability to write letters, or permission to gather in supervised groups could alter the atmosphere of an entire compound. When a section of ground was set aside for planting, it became one of those subtle but meaningful changes. At first, the task appeared practical. Soil needed to be cleared, stones removed, seeds distributed. But as days passed, the act of tending plants introduced a different kind of rhythm, one measured not by orders, but by growth. Some women approached the task cautiously, unsure whether it was temporary or symbolic. Others treated it with quiet focus. Hands that had once handled paperwork, medical tools, or radio equipment now pressed seeds into earth. Conversations formed around practical questions: how deep to plant, how often to water, whether anything would survive in the compacted soil of a former training ground. The work did not erase captivity. Fences remained. Guards watched from towers. Yet within a defined space, the act of cultivation created a narrow zone of agency. Psychological angle: expectation and disorientation. Years of wartime messaging inside Germany had shaped expectations about capture. Propaganda often depicted Allied forces as harsh occupiers, and rumors spread quickly in the final months of the war. Many prisoners entered Allied custody with heightened fear. Some expected immediate punishment. Others believed they would be transported far from home under severe conditions. The reality inside American-run camps was structured differently, governed by regulations and logistical constraints rather than vengeance. The gap between expectation and experience produced a subtle psychological shift. For some prisoners, initial suspicion remained. They watched for changes in behavior, trying to determine whether small privileges were temporary or conditional. Over time, routine began to replace uncertainty. Regular meals, medical care, and predictable schedules created a framework that was restrictive but stable. Stability, after years of chaos, could be both relieving and unsettling. Gardening and other supervised activities played a role in that adjustment. The presence of living plants inside a guarded compound challenged assumptions about what captivity would look like. It suggested that time was not only passing but being structured. Seeds planted in spring would require weeks of attention. Flowers, if they grew, would bloom within the same fences that defined confinement. This created a quiet tension between limitation and continuity. Prisoners were still confined, but the environment encouraged maintenance rather than survival alone. The psychological effect varied. Some women saw the activity as a temporary distraction. Others treated it as a way to mark days and weeks in a controlled environment. The act of caring for something that could grow introduced a future-oriented mindset, even if that future remained uncertain. It also provided a small measure of identity beyond the label of prisoner. Within the camp's hierarchy, tending a garden plot or flower bed became a defined role, one that required attention, cooperation, and patience. For American administrators, these effects were not always framed in emotional terms. Camp records and post-war analyses often described such activities in practical language: morale, discipline, routine. Yet from the perspective of those inside the wire, the impact could be more personal. The war had stripped away familiar structures and replaced them with abrupt transitions. Inside the camp, the introduction of structured activities, especially ones tied to growth and maintenance, helped create a fragile sense of continuity. Administrative and leadership angle: managing order after surrender. By mid-1945, the American military presence in Western Germany had shifted from combat operations to occupation and administration. Commanders responsible for prisoner-of-war compounds faced a logistical challenge that was both immediate and long-term. They were tasked with housing, feeding, documenting, and supervising thousands of capture personnel while also preparing for eventual repatriation or release. The war in Europe had ended on May 8th, but the machinery of war, records, transport networks, and displaced populations did not stop overnight. Camp leadership operated within a framework shaped by military regulation and international law. The 1929 Geneva Convention required humane treatment, adequate rations, medical care, and protection from violence or retaliation. It also encouraged the use of organized work and recreation to maintain order. These guidelines were not abstract ideals. They were practical tools for preventing unrest and maintaining control over large groups living in confined spaces. For women held in American custody, administrative decisions were often shaped by available facilities. Camps originally designed for male soldiers had to be adapted. Separate compounds were established where possible, sometimes with additional supervision by female military personnel, such as nurses or clerks assigned to administrative roles. Commandants documented numbers, health conditions, and occupational backgrounds. Records were essential, not only for accountability, but for eventual transfer, release, or repatriation once transport networks reopened. Within this administrative structure, small privileges or assignments were introduced gradually. Gardening plots, sewing rooms, and organized cleaning details were not acts of charity. They were components of camp management doctrine. Officers understood that idle populations were more difficult to supervise. Structured activity reduced tension and created predictable schedules. It also provided a visible demonstration that the camp operated under rules rather than arbitrary decisions. From a leadership perspective, allowing prisoners to cultivate small garden areas served multiple purposes. It improved the camp environment by reducing barren ground that could turn to mud or dust. It supplemented rations with fresh produce in some cases. And it gave prisoners a defined responsibility that required cooperation. The presence of flowers or cultivated plants inside a fenced compound also carried symbolic value, though this was rarely stated in official reports. It signaled that the camp was stable enough to permit long-term routine. Stability, in turn, reinforced authority. American officers and enlisted personnel assigned to guard duty experienced this environment from a different angle. Many had spent months in combat. Now they found themselves overseeing prisoners in a setting where discipline was maintained through procedure rather than force. Guard towers remained staffed. Patrols continued, but interactions with prisoners often shifted from confrontation to supervision. Instructions were given through translators or simple gestures. Over time, familiarity developed, not friendship, but recognition of routine. A guard who oversaw the same compound each day became a fixed part of the landscape, just as prisoners became part of the camp's daily rhythm. Symbolic and moral angle. The meaning of small permissions. In the broader context of 1945, the decision to allow prisoners to plant flowers or maintain gardens might appear minor. Cities across Europe lay in ruins. Millions were displaced. Entire nations faced reconstruction. Yet within the controlled environment of a POW camp, small permissions carried disproportionate meaning. They represented a shift from destruction toward maintenance, from immediate survival toward gradual normalization. For German women inside American custody, these changes were filtered through personal experience. Many had lived through years of strict wartime regulation. The end of the war brought relief for some, uncertainty for others, and loss for nearly all. Inside the camp, the act of planting seeds introduced a quiet reminder that life beyond the war still existed. It did not erase the reality of defeat or confinement. Fences and guards remained constant, but it introduced a form of routine that resembled civilian life more than military command. This symbolic dimension extended beyond individual perception. Allied occupation policy in Germany included elements of re-education and stabilization. While POW camps were not classrooms, they existed within the same broader framework. Treatment of prisoners would influence how former enemy populations viewed the occupying forces. Demonstrating adherence to international standards and avoiding unnecessary harshness was seen as both a moral obligation and a strategic choice. The goal was not to erase the conflict, but to prevent its continuation through resentment and disorder. At the same time, camp authorities remained cautious. Privileges could be revoked if discipline faltered. Activities were supervised and limited to designated areas. The structure of captivity did not change. Yet within that structure, the presence of cultivated space, flowers along a fence line, small gardens near barracks, introduced a visual contrast to the barbed wire and guard towers that defined the perimeter. The significance of these changes became clearer as the immediate aftermath of surrender settled into the longer process of occupation. What began as a temporary measure to maintain order would intersect with a broader turning point in the lives of those held behind the wire. The decisive turning point did not arrive with a single announcement inside the camp. By early May 1945, many prisoners already sensed that the war in Europe was nearing its end. Artillery in the distance had grown less frequent. Columns of refugees no longer passed along nearby roads. American patrols moved with less urgency. Then, on May 8th, the formal surrender of Germany was confirmed. The news spread through camps in fragments, through guards, through translators, through the subtle change in posture among the soldiers who watched the perimeter. For the women inside the compound, surrender marked a shift that was both immediate and delayed. Immediate, because the conflict that had defined their recent lives was officially over. Delayed, because captivity did not end with the signing of documents. Processing, repatriation, and the reorganization of occupied territory would take months, sometimes longer. The war had stopped. Their confinement continued. In the days that followed, camp administration adjusted to a new reality. Without active front lines nearby, the atmosphere became more controlled. Guards still carried weapons. Towers remained staffed. But the urgency of wartime security softened into the steadier routines of occupation. Administrative staff focused on record-keeping, health inspections, and the gradual sorting of prisoners according to status and destination. Lists were compiled. Names were checked and rechecked. Transport schedules, still uncertain, began to take shape in distant headquarters. Within the compound, the change was subtle but noticeable. Roll calls continued, but the tone shifted from immediate accountability to maintenance of order. Work assignments remained, though they were organized with longer-term planning in mind. The question was no longer how to manage prisoners during an active campaign, but how to sustain a controlled population during an undefined waiting period. It was during this transition that the designated garden plots began to matter in a new way. Before surrender, they had been introduced as a practical measure, an activity to occupy time, improve the camp environment, and supplement food supplies where possible. After surrender, they became markers of continuity. Seeds planted in early spring now showed signs of growth. Small shoots appeared along the fence line. Leaves pushed through soil that had been packed hard by years of military use. For some prisoners, the site carried a complicated emotional weight. The war that had shaped their lives was over, yet the future remained uncertain. Homes might be destroyed, families scattered, cities occupied by foreign armies. Inside the camp, growth continued at a steady pace, indifferent to the political collapse beyond the wire. The plants did not mark victory or defeat. They marked time. American camp authorities observed these developments through a practical lens. Stability inside the compound meant fewer disciplinary issues and less strain on limited personnel. Reports from various camps noted that structured activity, gardening, sewing, maintenance, helped maintain order among prisoners facing prolonged uncertainty. The introduction of such routines aligned with broader occupation policies that aimed to stabilize the region and prevent unrest during the fragile post-war period. Yet the turning point was not only administrative. It was psychological. The end of hostilities removed the immediate expectation of further combat. In its place came a quieter realization. Captivity would now be measured not in days until the next battle, but in weeks or months until release. For many, this realization arrived gradually. It settled in during evening roll calls, during the distribution of mail, during the slow work of tending soil that no longer felt entirely foreign. The presence of flowers, fragile, temporary, and carefully tended, did not change the fundamental reality of the camp. Fences still defined movement. Guards still enforced rules. But the visual contrast between cultivated ground and military enclosure created a subtle shift in perception. The camp was no longer a transient holding area on the edge of a battlefield. It had become a managed environment where time could pass long enough for seeds to grow and bloom. That shift, quiet but unmistakable, set the stage for the deeper transformation that would unfold as the occupation period settled in and the routines of captivity extended beyond the end of war. By early summer 1945, the compounds that had once operated as temporary holding areas had settled into the longer rhythm of occupation. Administrative reports moved through headquarters in steady streams. Prisoner counts were verified. Health inspections were conducted regularly. Supply deliveries, though still dependent on fragile transport networks, arrived with greater predictability. The camps no longer functioned at the edge of battle. They had become structured environments designed to contain uncertainty until larger political decisions could be implemented. Within the fenced compounds, the small garden plots and flower beds continued to change. Where there had been bare soil weeks earlier, green shoots now lined the edges of pathways and fences. Some plots produced vegetables intended to supplement rations. Others were planted with simple flowers, marigolds, daisies, whatever seeds were available through military supply channels or gathered locally. The choice of flowers was rarely symbolic in an official sense. They were hardy, easy to grow, and suited to the soil. Yet their presence altered the visual landscape of the camp in ways that neither guards nor prisoners could ignore. For the German women tending these plots, the work created a daily point of focus. Watering schedules were established. Weeds were pulled. Tools were returned to designated storage areas after use. These routines, small in scale, provided a sense of continuity within an environment defined by waiting. Captivity remained real and inescapable, but the act of tending living plants introduced a task that extended beyond immediate survival. It required attention to time measured in days and weeks rather than hours. The turning point was not dramatic. There were no formal ceremonies marking the change. Instead, it emerged through accumulation. A row of flowers began to bloom along a fence line. A patch of vegetables grew tall enough to be harvested. The compound, once defined entirely by its function as a place of confinement, now contained visible signs of maintenance and care. For those inside, this shift did not erase defeat or uncertainty. It did, however, create a space where routine could exist alongside confinement without constant tension. American guards and administrative staff observed the change with pragmatic interest. A stable camp required fewer interventions. Orderly routines meant fewer disciplinary reports. Prisoners engaged in structured activity were less likely to challenge authority or fall into despair that could disrupt the compound. In official documentation, such developments were often recorded in neutral terms: morale stable, work details functioning, health conditions improving. The language remained administrative, but the effects were human. The broader context of occupation policy also shaped these developments. Allied authorities sought to stabilize Germany after years of total war. While POW camps were not the central mechanism of reconstruction, they existed within the same environment. Demonstrating consistent adherence to international standards of treatment reinforced the legitimacy of occupation forces. It signaled that the conflict had ended and that the post-war order would be governed by rules rather than retribution. The presence of organized, well-managed camps, where prisoners received food, medical care, and structured activity, formed part of that message. For the women inside the compound, the realization that the camp would exist long enough for flowers to bloom carried a quiet emotional weight. It underscored the duration of their confinement while also marking the passage of time in a tangible way. Days became linked to growth. The first leaves, the first buds, the first blossoms. Conversations formed around these changes. Observations were shared. In a setting where much remained uncertain, the cycle of planting and blooming provided a small but consistent measure of continuity. The decisive shift, then, was not a single moment of revelation, but a gradual recognition. The war had ended. Captivity remained. Yet within the boundaries of the camp, routines had formed that resembled elements of ordinary life. The presence of flowers did not alter the political realities of defeat or occupation. It did not change the authority structure that governed every aspect of the compound, but it introduced a visible contrast to the destruction that had defined the preceding years. As summer advanced and administrative plans for repatriation and release began to take clearer shape, the camp entered its next phase. The routines established during the turning point, roll calls, work details, garden plots, would now exist alongside preparations for departure and the uncertain journey back into a transformed Germany. The months following the surrender of Germany brought a new set of challenges for both prisoners and camp administrators. While the war had officially ended, repatriation was not immediate. Transportation networks were damaged. Cities lay in ruins, complicating the return of millions of displaced people. In the meantime, camps continued to operate under the supervision of the United States Army, ensuring that prisoners remained safe, fed, and accounted for. For German women, the daily routines established during the turning point now became part of a longer, more stable environment. Gardening continued, not merely as a novelty, but as a structured activity tied to camp administration. Plots that had produced early blooms now matured. Some women harvested vegetables to supplement rations. Others tended flowers, pruning buds, and observing seasonal changes. In their personal reflections, many described the experience as unexpectedly calming, a quiet anchor in a life marked by upheaval. Reports from American camp administrators highlighted the practical benefits. Structured activities reduced idle time, minimized disciplinary incidents, and improved the psychological well-being of prisoners. Medical officers noted that engagement in routine work, including gardening, cleaning, and maintenance, correlated with fewer instances of illness and mental distress. By combining the principles of Geneva Convention compliance with practical camp management, administrators created an environment that balanced security with humane treatment. The arrival of mail and limited news from outside also shaped the post-war experience. Letters from family members, sometimes delayed by months due to disrupted communication channels, became points of anticipation. Prisoners marked these arrivals alongside the progress of their garden plots, linking the slow, deliberate growth of plants with a gradual reconnection to their former lives. Within the camp, informal hierarchies formed among the women. Those with previous leadership experience in military or administrative roles often coordinated work details, supervised gardening plots, and organized small educational or recreational activities. Cooperation was necessary. Shared responsibility reduced tension and built a sense of community, however fragile, inside the fences. For American officers, the development of these micro-communities was a positive outcome, reducing the need for intervention and demonstrating the prisoner's ability to self-organize within prescribed boundaries. At the same time, the broader environment outside the camp remained in flux. German cities faced destruction, shortages, and the uncertain process of rebuilding political and civil institutions. Many women entering these camps came from areas heavily impacted by bombing campaigns or ground fighting. For some, captivity became a temporary refuge from chaos, providing predictable food, shelter, and medical care that contrasted sharply with conditions in liberated urban areas. The psychological contrast was stark. Outside, a defeated nation struggled with the collapse of authority, rationing, and loss. Inside, captivity imposed restrictions but also offered stability. The act of planting flowers became emblematic of this contrast, a visible, living measure of order inside a confined but predictable space. Prisoners could mark time through growth, tending, and observation in ways that were impossible in the wider world, where survival was far less certain. This period also shaped how women would later remember their captivity. Memoirs and oral histories frequently note the small freedoms, gardening, writing letters, supervised walks, that stood out amid the larger reality of confinement. The combination of strict adherence to rules and minor personal agency left lasting impressions. Even decades later, some recounted that these small permissions, though limited, provided hope, purpose, and a sense of humanity during an otherwise disorienting period. The routines of summer 1945, gardening, cleaning, meals, and supervised recreation, set the stage for the eventual repatriation process. Seeds sown in spring had matured into flowers and vegetables, marking the passage of time with a quiet but unmistakable rhythm. Within these fences, the prisoners experienced the first sustained moments of normalcy since capture, even as uncertainty about the world beyond the camp remained. By late 1945, plans for repatriation were underway, though the process remained slow and methodical. Transportation networks across Europe were still recovering from years of bombing, destroyed bridges, and disrupted railways. American administrators prioritized prisoners based on health, location, and logistical feasibility. The women who had spent months inside camps were gradually moved to collection points, awaiting ships, trains, or convoys that would carry them back to their homes, which in many cases had been partially or completely destroyed. The transition from captivity to civilian life was difficult. Many German women returned to cities or towns where homes were in ruins, family members missing, and basic necessities scarce. Yet the contrast between camp life and the chaos outside reinforced the perception that the controlled environment of the POW compound had provided safety, sustenance, and stability. Accounts from former prisoners frequently highlight the enduring impression of these months, especially small acts of agency, such as tending flowers or participating in routine work, that had offered a sense of purpose amidst the uncertainty of defeat. Statistical records indicate that, throughout U.S.-managed POW camps, mortality among female prisoners was extremely low. Reports attribute this to reliable food rations, medical care, and adherence to Geneva Convention standards. Diseases such as dysentery, influenza, and malnutrition-related complications, which have been severe threats in wartime Europe, were largely mitigated within camp confines. Structured activity, including gardening, not only improved morale, but also contributed indirectly to health by encouraging physical movement and engagement with sunlight and fresh air. Post-war analysis of Allied camp administration further highlights the symbolic and practical role of structured prisoner routines. Gardening programs, supervised recreational activities, and educational opportunities were not mere concessions. They were integrated into a broader strategy of humane detention and operational efficiency. Officers and administrators observed that prisoners engaged in these activities were calmer, more cooperative, and better able to tolerate the delays inherent in the repatriation process. Memoirs from both prisoners and guards emphasize that these routines shaped day-to-day life in ways that extended beyond immediate practicality, fostering resilience, adaptation, and a small but meaningful sense of autonomy. For the women who had tended flowers, the act became emblematic of their time in captivity. Seeds planted in spring had transformed into growth, mirroring their passage through an environment simultaneously restrictive and structured, controlled yet unexpectedly humane. Gardens became a private measure of time and effort, visible proof that patience and care produced results even under confinement. For some, these memories persisted as moments of calm and stability, standing in contrast to the violence, fear, and uncertainty that had dominated the previous years. Historians examining POW policy in World War II note that the treatment of female prisoners reflected both practical and moral considerations. The Geneva Convention provided the legal framework, but the way in which camp administrators applied its principles influenced long-term perceptions of the Allies in occupied territories. Allowing prisoners to engage in structured work, maintain small gardens, and observe their own accomplishments reinforced the legitimacy of Allied authority while also preserving human dignity in a time defined by destruction and displacement. As repatriation continued into 1946, camps gradually emptied, leaving behind orderly rows of barracks, cultivated soil, and traces of routines that had structured prisoners' daily lives. Gardens that had once been carefully tended by women now remained in place for subsequent groups or were dismantled as facilities were repurposed. Yet the impact of these experiences endured in personal memory. Former prisoners often recalled that small acts of autonomy, planting a flower, cultivating a vegetable, caring for the soil, provided psychological sustenance, marking the boundary between survival and engagement, captivity and continuity. The lessons of these months would carry beyond the camps themselves. They influenced post-war discussions of POW management, contributed to occupational policy, and shaped broader understandings of human resilience under confinement. Within the wire, behind fences and guard towers, the simple act of planting flowers became both a literal and symbolic anchor in a chaotic, uncertain world. The story of German women tending flowers inside American POW camps is quiet, yet it carries profound significance. It demonstrates that even amid the machinery of war and the strictures of captivity, human resilience finds expression in the smallest acts. Soil pressed between fingers, seeds pressed into the earth, and the gradual emergence of green shoots offered a measure of control, purpose, and continuity, things that war had taken from them in abundance. This episode reflects the broader philosophy underpinning Allied POW management. Discipline, structure, and adherence to international law did not preclude humanity. They created an environment where prisoners could exercise limited autonomy while remaining under guard. Gardening, work details, and supervised routines were not merely administrative tools. They were mechanisms through which prisoners could maintain psychological stability, observe the passage of time, and mark personal achievement in a controlled world. For historians, the significance extends beyond individual experience. The treatment of female POWs provides a lens into the contrast between ideological expectation and operational reality. Many of these women had grown up under propaganda that anticipated harsh, vengeful Allied behavior. Instead, they encountered measured authority, structured care, and unexpected freedoms. The presence of flowers in the camp, something so mundane yet profoundly human, embodied a moral dimension to post-war administration. Victory did not require cruelty, and control did not demand dehumanization. On a deeper level, the story reminds us that war is not experienced solely through battles and strategy, but through the texture of daily life. Within fenced compounds, behind watchtowers, and under the constant oversight of military authority, prisoners navigated fear, uncertainty, and loss. Yet they also navigated small joys, rituals, and rhythms that echoed life beyond confinement. Growth, whether of plants or resilience, became possible even in the shadow of conflict. The image of German women tending flowers in a camp is thus emblematic. A moment of unexpected calm, a gesture of human dignity within the strict boundaries of war's aftermath, and a quiet testament to the enduring capacity for order, care, and hope, even in the most constrained circumstances. It serves as a reminder that even behind wire and authority, life persists, adapts, and finds ways to flourish.